All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Phillips Manor Hall History Lecture Series, sponsored in part by the Friends of Phillips Manor Hall and Tompkins Bank. Joining me tonight is James Finelli. James is a public historian with 15 years experience in historic preservation, historic sites, and colonial America. He has previously worked for the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, which is our state historic site groups, and for Plymouth Patuxet Museums in Plymouth, Massachusetts. James tonight will be talking to us about his lecture, It Was Dark Back Then, The Culture of Nighttime in the 18th Century, which is just the best title. So if anybody has any questions, you can drop them in the chat and I will moderate at the end of the talk. But I am going to turn off my video and mute myself. So welcome, James. Take it away.
All right, let me just get going there. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in this evening, and for Sarah and Phillips Manor Hall for inviting me to do this talk. Just a brief bit of background on this talk. I have done various iterations of this for almost as long as I've been in the history field. It kind of has evolved over the years from a ghost program to a 17th century nighttime program, and then back to the 18th century, and has gone through many iterations. But tonight, I'm very interested to have this discussion tonight because I feel like it is a building up of all those years of thinking about this subject. And I hope that's reflected in this presentation. So let's get started. As Sarah said, my lecture is called It Was Dark Back Then, The Culture of Nighttime in the 18th Century. I anticipate this talk to be about an hour long, and we're hoping for some time at the end for some Q&A. But I want to start by kind of laying down sort of a groundwork for everyone, because I know there's going to be people coming from a variety of backgrounds, and they may not really be familiar with what the 18th century was in and of itself. I think having spent, now most of my adulthood thinking about the 18th century, I forget sometimes that people don't even know what I'm talking about because it's something they may never have even thought about. So I thought, let's just start with some brief definitions here so we can all be on the same page in this presentation. So what was the 18th century? So strictly speaking, if you say it's the 18th century, it's the 1700s. 1700 to 1799, and that is just dissatisfying because it's not like you live in 1799 and especially as an adult, and you're living your life, and then suddenly 1800 happens and you're like, oh, we're in a different century, I'm going to change everything I do. That's not how it works. And for that reason, I think historians, especially more in recent years, have sort of reconceptualized the past, less with an emphasis on centuries or even decades, which are just arbitrary numbers, but thinking more broadly in the form of eras. And so in Great Britain, especially, they use this term called the long 18th century. And that's roughly defined as 1688 to 1815. Again, somewhat arbitrary in the numbers, but they pick these numbers for a reason. It's from the Glorious Revolution in 1688, when the last of the Roman Catholic kings of England was overthrown, and pretty much laid the groundwork for the modern monarchy in Great Britain and modern Great Britain. And 1815, which is the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon Bonaparte is defeated and decisively, and really ends a long period of warfare in Europe and remakes much of the map. So a lot of the countries, the European countries we associate today with Europe, their identities date to that 1815 post 1815 period. They redrew the map of Europe in that time period. Some of the other terms you hear thrown around is this concept of early modern versus modern, or early modern era versus the modern era. What does that really mean? You see, again, somewhat arbitrary dates thrown around for these, but roughly speaking, when you say something is early modern, you're talking about pretty much post Renaissance, or towards the end of the Renaissance, getting into the definition of what is today modern, the modern mind, modern thinking, and the modern era is what we're in now. So what you see with the 18th century is that transition from the early modern era to the modern era. It's a change in thinking and viewing of the world. And some of that, a big part of that, is brought about by the Enlightenment, which, incidentally, for the long 18th century, pretty much starts in the 1680s and 1690s and really comes to its greatest fruition at the end of the 18th century. One of the other major things that happen in this time period is Great Britain becomes an empire. Throughout most of British history, Great Britain was, first of all, it wasn't even Great Britain until the first decade of the 18th century. It was always England, Scotland, and Ireland. Scotland and England became unified in the early 18th century and became Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and then eventually absorbed part of Ireland. And so they become identified very much with this century. This is when Great Britain becomes the premier power, colonial imperial power, and power broker of the world is during this period. So these are some parameters that or groundwork that I've set, some terms, ideas. Now I'm going to go into parameters for this talk, because I thought about this and I thought, well, saying I'm going to talk about the culture of nighttime in the 18th century is so broad. I'm not talking about Asia or Africa or South America. In fact, I'm not actually talking about all of North America or all of Europe. My interest, my knowledge base is primarily on Great Britain and British North America. That said, I will use examples from other parts of Europe that would have been known to people in Great Britain and British North America and fed into sort of the psyche of the time period. Also, now that I've defined the long 18th century, while I will be bringing in examples throughout the century, my interest and knowledge base is much more focused on the mid to late century period. And so a lot of the images I'll be choosing and examples I'll bring up will reflect that. But generally, what I will be talking about will be applicable across Europe and North America during this time period, across the entire long 18th century, unless otherwise explicitly noted, and will be generally applicable across all social classes. It's a shared experience. So now that I've set down those parameters, I want to think about how we can, or how people in the period would have conceptualized nighttime. And I was thinking about this. This was a new way of kind of looking at it than I've done in the past. But a lot of the times when you look at writing from the time period, or images from the time period, or even just think about social events, they kind of get divided into these three categories, roughly. And they're somewhat chronological, but there's a lot of overlap. So starting on the right here, that's a witch's circle from an early 18th century book on witchcraft. And that would have been associated with night, which activity was very, very much associated with nighttime. That would be when they would be essentially, as one of the terms would have been been used at the time, cavorting with the devil. That is one way of looking at nighttime in the 18th century. Superstition, as it might be termed, very religiously focused, very religiously oriented. Very focused on fear. And then in the middle, you have this sort of reason / satire. And this image is great. This is a satirical print from the more of the early to mid 18th century, showing the city of London at night. And you can see how it's just absolute chaos and absurdity. Someone's burning something in the street, which causes a carriage to crash, and someone from the carriage is shooting off a gun. And then someone is dumping excrement out a window onto the people down below. It's completely insane. Obviously, this print was created for a consumer market. People were actually took this print and others like it and posted it on the walls in their home for entertainment because it was supposed to be, funny. And so, there is this humor in it, but it also, aside from being satirical, is reflecting some of the nitty-gritty realities of life in the 18th century and at night. And then on the left here, it's what I term sort of the aesthetic, which is a product of the Enlightenment, a product of the Age of Reason, but it's almost like the next step. It's the I no longer have an unreasoning fear of night, but I'm not putting it down. I'm not looking at it coldly. I'm looking at the beauty in it. And so one of the things that happens during this time period that affects sort of the mentality of nighttime is this definition of what is called the sublime. And in our modern mindset, we might think of the sublime as, maybe associated with religion. But in the 18th century, there's a lot of thought around aesthetics and beauty. And this idea that the sublime is essentially something that causes terror, but also inspires awe. And that there's a beauty in that terror and awe. And there's going to be a few places along the way. I'm keeping it light, but a few places along the way where I will read a brief passage to emphasize a point. And this is one that I thought was great to start this discussion. At the beginning of the 18th century, really actually before the 18th century on the calendar actually began, John Locke, the English philosopher, writes that basically, the human mind is a blank slate. When you're born, there's nothing there. You can imprint on the mind anything you want. And in so doing, that affects the kind of person you are when you become an adult and creates the society you live in. So in essence, the idea is that if you make good impressions on the mind early on, you'll ultimately make better adults and a better society. And one of the famous examples of this is tied to darkness. And he uses this sort of image of children being afraid of the dark because their nursemaids tell them ghost stories. And what he argues is, look, if you never tell them a ghost story, if they're never exposed to these superstitions, as he would refer to them, and you just take a child by the hand and you bring them into a dark room and show them there's nothing to be afraid of, you in effect are creating an environment where they have no innate fear of darkness and of night. In the mid 18th century, the Irish philosopher and politician Edmund Burke writes a very influential book that will go on to influence a lot of aesthetics into the early 19th century. And the book is called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Idea of the Sublime and Beautiful. And that's like the perfect 18th century title, of a thinking man. But it's really a fascinating book. And in the book, he actually respectfully disagrees with Locke's interpretation of the fear of night and the fear of darkness. And what he says here is this: we have considered darkness as a cause of the sublime, and we have all along considered the sublime as depending on some modification of pain or terror. So that, if darkness be no way painful or terrible to any who have not had their minds early tainted with superstitions, it can be no source of the sublime to them. But with all deference to such an authority, i.e., Locke, he's disputing Locke here, it seems to me that an association of a more general nature, and an association which takes in all mankind, may make darkness terrible. And he goes on to say, as to the association of ghosts and goblins, surely it is more natural to think that darkness, being originally an idea of terror, was chosen as a fit scene for such terrible representations, than that such representations have made darkness terrible. So essentially what he's saying here is that there's something innately human about being afraid of the dark and afraid of nighttime. And it's how we perceive it as humans. And that's why we populate the nighttime with things that are scary. So now that I've kind of put some of those ideas out there, let's get into the main meat of what we're going to talk about, the actual experience of nighttime in the 18th century. So I was talking to a colleague about this presentation, and she had made some comment about historical movies. And, they're always, for people who study history and are particularly interested in folkways and lifeways, historical movies are so interesting because it's sometimes fun to point out what's wrong with them, but it's also at the same time kind of harder and more interesting to point out what's right. And I just put together this assortment of historical films that take place in the latter part of the 18th century or very, very early 19th century. And you'll see that these are all populated with candles. Candles in the 18th century were the primary a source of light for people at this time. And it seems appropriate to start my discussion really after having talked about dark to go right into the light, how people experienced their environment using light to make it a usable time period or usable period of the day. And you'll see here there's the wide arrangement, lots of candles and some, few in others. Some are very bright, some are very dark. I do want to draw your attention specifically, though, to the image in the upper left. That's an image from the Stanley Kubrick film Barry Lyndon. This photo doesn't look too bad, but in many of the scenes in Barry Lyndon, it's like a gajillion candles, like to the point of absurdity. And even for the wealthy, you tended to be sparing with candles. These candles were very expensive. But I imagine that the reason why he uses so many candles in this movie is that he innovated a technique of filming which allowed him to light the set entirely by candlelight and allowed the cameras to actually film entirely by candlelight. He wanted the glow to be like a painting. He wanted it to be authentic. So you definitely get some of that candle glow there. In the lower right, that's actually, it's kind of hard to see, and it should be hard to see. That is a image from the movie Last of the Mohicans, which you wouldn't think as being one of the more accurate 18th century films, but is. And there is literally a room of people sitting around a table in a house talking, and there's a single candle in the middle of them. And I just love that. It's perfect. So here are actually some 18th century images, cartoons and paintings showing candlelit spaces, but not just candlelit spaces, but spaces where people are living their lives. And you can just see that the limited use of candles, the image in the center at the bottom there, it's a servant in an affluent household is dressed up as a ghost and is scaring everyone who's playing cards. But I love the fact it's clearly an affluent household, and they're playing cards by one candle. In the upper left, this is a great image because beyond the fact that it's in color, it's showing you not just the placement of the candles, the fact that you have the candles at the corners of the card table. Card tables in this time period were frequently built with little niches or little stands on the side to hold candles, because the understanding is you're going to be playing cards in the evening and you need the candles there so you can see. But you can also see there's some light being generated by the fireplace, but really there's a few strategically placed candles around the room. And then over the fireplace, you have what is called a pier glass. It was called that because it was supposed to be placed in the pier, right, between, two windows or two architectural features in a home. And the idea is that it would maximize reflection of light in a room. Not just during the day with sunlight, but at night especially. And you see that the frame here is gilded, gold gild, which of course is going to be reflective. And then you've got integral sconces that are themselves also reflective. So trying to maximize the use of the light from those candles. And then here's some real world examples. So on the right there, you have a table set for a meal, and you've got all this, silver plate, silver candlesticks. In a less affluent household, they would have pewter, which would be shine to a very high shine to try to mimic silver. So again, maximizing those reflective surfaces. The image on the left there is, I believe, a parlor. And you can see the massive pier glass against that wall. It's actually made from multiple pieces of glass, multiple mirrors, all kind of stitched together. And this is a Rococo style frame, very, very over the top, but it's all gilded. It's really just, this was entirely lit. I took that photo. It was entirely lit by natural light, so it really brightened up the room. And you can see, of course, the frames around the paintings are gilded. And then the wall is a silk damask, which has a sheen to it. So that the wall itself was shining and reflecting into the room. And this even extended to what you wore on your body. So this is just a somewhat of a random assortment of surviving garments from different periods in the 18th century. Again, this is obviously more affluent consumers of this wardrobe, but it shows you the basic idea: bright fabrics, metallic thread either woven into the fabric or stitched on. You even see the use of what they call spangles, which are basically sequins in the time period, even on men's dress, where they might outline the clothing or the vest or the coat or the pockets with sequins or with gold tape or silver tape. It even extended to having shiny buttons. I love this cartoon on the right. It's called Steel Buttons, and it's this gentleman is taking a walk, and he's blinding the lady who's passing him because his buttons are so big and shiny. Having shiny buttons was of course very important for people who are well dressed. You had to keep the sheen on them. The tool in the lower middle there, that is actually it's a metal plate. It's a brass plate that you would slide behind the buttons while they were still attached to the coat, so that you could polish them without getting polish on the coat. There are actually plenty of existing examples from the time period of men's garments where it actually has the buttons attached to the coat with a leather tie or some other similar device on the inside, so that you could untie it to take the button off to clean it and then put it back on without damaging the coat. And then again, highlighting the sort of the luminescence of fabric, the portrait of the lady on the left there is she's probably wearing a silk taffeta which has a definite shine to it. And in fact, she might even, it's hard to tell here, but she appears to have some sort of metallic thread or lace on her dress as well. So now that you're in effect blinged out, what are you going to do? Well, at nighttime, you didn't necessarily go straight to bed. There were entertainments, and the masquerade was actually at its zenith during the 18th century. It exists before and after, but it really has its greatest vogue. And it has its origin in the way that it is at least understood and practiced in Great Britain, in Venice, or what was Venetian Carnival. And Carnival is tied to the Lent season. It's the same festival time period as we know in the Americas, like Mardi Gras and Carnival down in Brazil. It has the same origin. And the Venetian Carnival season was a big tourist attraction. People would dress in fanciful costumes, wear masks. Gambling was very popular. This is actually a 18th century Venetian image of the inside of a casino. And you can even see some people in the background at some of the gambling tables. And here are some English examples, or British examples, that show you some masquerade scenes and just the variety and outlandishness of some of the costumes. If you can see here, you've got someone who looks like they're dressed as a dancing bear with an organ grinder. There's a guy dressed as a monk standing next to someone dressed as a coffin. You can actually see his little feet sticking out of the bottom. There, of course, are historical figures mixed in here, figures from mythology, dressing like native people or people from perceived exotic locations was very popular. There's even a guy down there in the corners dressed like a devil. So it's in a way it's similar to Halloween as we celebrate it today. A lot of just these outlandish costumes that are inspired by different cultures or by different time periods. Now, masquerades could vary in size. They could be a more intimate event, like the image in the upper left, which is actually at the British Palace. So this is obviously a more exclusive event. But a lot of masquerades were big public events put on by an opera house or some other public venue. And anyone could buy a ticket to attend. It was open to all social classes. And in fact, that was the origin for some of the condemnation during the time period by some people who didn't like the idea of a bunch of people getting together, wearing masks. You didn't know who they were. They didn't fear being condemned by bad behavior because no one would know who it was the next day. And it allowed, lower class people and upper class people to intermingle. That was a definite concern in the time period. And here are some examples of some costumes in portraiture. The lady on the left here is wearing what would be known as Turkish dress, which was kind of a catch-all term for an exotic costume that was seen as coming from the East, usually with a turban like this woman has. And she's also holding a Venetian mask. The portrait on the right is interesting because this is actually the portrait of the daughter of a planter from South Carolina in the mid-18th century. There is no documentation of masquerades ever taking place in North America during the colonial period, but the masquerade was a well-known cultural trope. It was part of the wider culture at the time. And definitely there were Americans who experienced masquerades in Europe. And there are examples of Americans who didn't even go to Europe and never even been to a masquerade, still having their portrait done in masquerade dress. So this woman is actually wearing what would be known as Van Dyke dress. which was sort of a generic term used for clothing that was inspired by Van Dyck paintings from the 17th century, so from the 100 years before. Lots of lacy collars and draping fabrics and over-the-top jewelry with pearls that no one ever actually wore. It's hard to see because the image is dark, but you can. She's holding in her hand a black velvet mask called a moretta. And the moretta is very interesting because it usually would be worn by a woman. It would be held in place by a bead or button that was stitched to the mouth. So you would bite it in your teeth. And that, of course, precluded your ability to talk while you were wearing it. But what's interesting is that it was something that was worn at the masquerade by ladies, but also was incredibly popular amongst women in colonial North America during the 18th century. Because one, you could wear it on the street and it would prevent your face from getting sunburned. And also it was a convenient way to avoid having to talk to men you didn't want to talk to. And there are examples of men complaining that, they went to go say hi to a beautiful woman as she went by and she put her moretta on and stared at him as she walked by. And he's like, hey, it's kind of like the modern equivalent of, the annoying guy trying to get a girl to take her headphones off at, Starbucks. So I love that was part of the culture. And then probably the most dramatic event to ever happen at a masquerade in the 18th century was the assassination of the King of Sweden. Gustav III, who was a powerful Swedish king in the late 18th century, was attending a masquerade ball at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm, which an opera house that he himself created. And when he was shot by assassins in masquerade costume, he died several days later. But it was from the wound he received at the masquerade ball. And the image on the right is his actual costume, which I actually got to see this in person during a visit to Sweden once. And it's amazing the Swedish government has retained his costume. And you can see it's basically a Van Dyck dress. You can see there's like the frilly collar, and he's got what would be called hose, which would be the leggings that he's wearing, which would have been associated with an earlier time period. And then he's got, of course, a mask, and his hat is sort of in a Venetian style with the fur on it. And there are places and homes in this time period specifically for evening entertaining. This is actually a particularly interesting example from England, from Kettleston Hall, which is a circular saloon, which it's a British term used in Great Britain and in British North America. And it comes from the French salon. It's essentially a large entertaining room, frequently where dancing within a great household would take place. This is a spectacular room because it is circular with a domed roof with a skylight, as you can see, and that floor is reinforced with springs, so the floor can take the pressure of the dancing. And kind of to circle back to this perception of people being out partying and just there's no good to come from it. This is a satirical print from the mid-18th century called A Midnight Modern Conversation. And you can see clearly that it's late. These guys really should be at home, and they're just getting smashed. And I chose only PG-13 images for this talk, but there are plenty of very not PG-13 images showing nighttime cavorting that are absolutely hysterical, but I wasn't going to show here. Of course, not everyone went out. There were lots of homebodies, and there were things to do at night in the home. So this was just a few kind of like little snapshots of life, I guess you could say. The image on the left is from a French image. It's a French image. It's roughly translates to wishing Happy New Year to Grandpapa. And I love that. So it's, the children are wishing a Happy New Year to their grandfather during the night. And then the one on the right is great. The woman is working at a writing desk. And I just love that the candle has a shade on it. I don't know how they didn't get it to light on fire, but I love that it has a shade. And then there were people who had less glamorous things to do when it got dark. Just like today, there were people back then where they had night jobs. And one of those night jobs was the night soilman. Night soil was a euphemism in the time period for basically excrement dug out of a privy or outhouse, which had to be done periodically because those things fill up. And these guys would be hired to go in and dig it out in the middle of the night because no one wants to see them doing that during the day. And in fact, this advertisement on the left here actually shows the cart with the moon over it. So you can even see it. There's not just the name, but even in the advertising, it's being explicitly associated with nighttime. Funerals would be something sometimes you would see at night. Most would happen during the day, but because of the cost of candles, there is this desire for conspicuous consumption during this time period. There's a vast material wealth that's being spread out to ever larger segments of society in the 18th century. And there's this desire to show off your wealth. Funerals in particular were roughly equivalent in the 18th century to a wedding today. It is a life passage event where people want to be seen, they want to have the perfect one, and they want to show off as much wealth as they can. So if you can have a flashy nighttime funeral where you're wasting money on a ton of candles, that's even better. But not all nighttime burials were particularly glamorous. Unfortunately, during this time period, there were devastating plagues in both Europe and in America. And generally, the practice in this time period was to do your burials at night. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is no one wants to be walking in the street and a bunch of, diseased corpses are being brought by on a cart. But one of the other reasons is to contain fear. There's a desire to prevent panic amongst the populace. If you can't see how many people are being buried from who had died the day before, maybe you're going to panic less because it doesn't look as bad. And then, of course, within the home, getting ready for bed or relaxation, there's special clothing for that. So we're back inside the house now. On the left here, there's a gentleman who's just prepared for some evening leisure time. He's wearing what is called a banyan with a cap. It usually would come with a cap. It doesn't always match, but his doesn't quite match, but it could match. And a banyan was basically like a bathrobe. You took your coat off. If you were of a generation that still wore wigs, he would take the wig off, as this gentleman clearly has. And you put your cap on, put on your banyan. It's a lot more comfortable, and you might do some reading, writing, just some quiet home time stuff. When you're actually getting into bed, there's special, sleepwear. With the women, you would usually have like a nightgown and some sort of cap. With men, you would have a night shirt, which would be essentially like a normal shirt in the time period, but oversized, and a nightcap. And it was important to make sure that you were wearing something on your head because in this time period, they believed in the humors. And the humors, basically, it's this theory that goes back to the ancient Greeks that says that disease and illness is caused or at least exacerbated by the humors, which are these opposing elemental forces, hot and cold, wet and dry, and then there's some combination of the two. And the belief was the moon, because it pulls the tides, it all must pull moisture, and so it might pull moisture towards your head, and it's wet outside because of dew, and that would affect your brain, and you might go crazy. That's where loony comes from. Here you have just a couple of examples of what beds would look like. bed hangings were pretty ubiquitous. The reasons for this range from privacy and cramped living spaces to maintaining heat within the home. It's important to remember that even the wealthy would bank their fire, which means putting ashes over it to smother it at night. You wouldn't burn a fire during the night, and a big reason for that is safety. You don't want to cause a fire in the home from untended fireplace. So that means progressively as the night goes by, that the house gets colder. So it's very important to try to trap as much heat around the bed and your body as you can. And for that reason, in part, bed sharing was also very common. You can see an older woman and a younger woman sharing a bed here on the right. One of the other things I want to point out is while there's growing material wealth being shared over a wider area in this time period, home furnishings are still going to be extremely expensive. And for the average person, you might have a very limited number of home furnishings, but you're going to probably spend most of your money on your bed. That's not just on the frame itself, but it's on those bed hangings. Fabric is very expensive in this time period, and it's also a way you show off. So having expensive bed hangings is a way, another conspicuous consumption of the time period. And this is very high end, but it shows you to what extent you might go. This is all photos of the same bed, but you can see the bed hangings as a flame stitch, which is all hand stitched. This is needlework. The inside is just lavishly embroidered. That female figure down near the bottom of the bed near the headboard, that is entirely hand embroidered. And even the underside of the canopy is got this just elaborate needlework, so you have something to stare at while you're laying in bed. So inside the home, you doesn't really matter how much money you have. Your living space or your sleeping space, I shouldn't say living space, sleeping space is often still going to be pretty intimate. And a lot of that has to do with, just retaining heat in a smaller space. In colonial North America, and this would be early republic because this is after the American Revolution, but still late 18th century. These are from the Hudson Valley. These were people who had some wealth because they could afford a stone house rather than essentially a wood shanty. But it's 2 rooms. You have a kitchen on the right, which you can tell is the kitchen because it's got a bigger fireplace. And then you have what would be called the parlor on the left there, which the fireplace is smaller. It's just for heat. You don't cook in that. And the parlor essentially in this time period is a catch-all room. You use it for all your living. Everything you do in that room. And then that's where you set down to sleep at night too. Servants, if you had a household with servants or extended family, they might sleep in the kitchen. But generally, that's associated with being lower down the social ladder within the household. But that's a New York example. Here's a New England example. This is actually the John Adams birthplace. And this is a classic New England salt box from the more middle part of the 18th century. Literally, it is 2 rooms on the first floor in the front, 2 rooms on the top. And then the salt box, which is that shed off the back, would have been added usually a little bit later to form the salt box. And that would be an additional back room, a lesser room off the back there. So there's not a lot of room to move around, as far as, everyone getting their own bedroom. That's not going to happen. And you can just see here that the image at the top is the kitchen, and the image on the bottom is the parlor. And you can just see like how low the ceiling is, really how intimate these spaces are. Some of that has to do with, the availability of materials and labor and the cost and all of that. But a big part of that is retaining heat. And it even trickles or reverse trickles. I can't really use the term trickle, but it goes all the way up the social ladder. This is Kettleston Hall again. And you can see on the right, that's the entry hall, which is the rectangular on the floor plan, the rectangular room in the middle with the little circles. Those are the columns. The saloon is the room behind it, the circular room I showed you earlier. And then the image on the left is one of the bedrooms, and that would be in the family wing, which would be that block in the lower left after that curved hyphen. And you can see these are significantly smaller, not just in their, length and width, but the height of the ceiling. And it's a little hard because I took the photo weird when I took it, but if you look in there, you can see there's a door. You can get a sense of the space and the fact that there were several people in the room with me. It's not a big room. And again, even if you're a lord with a lot of money, you're going to want a nice intimate bedroom because, it's just more comfortable. So you may then, from there, transition to the idea of bifurcated sleep. And what do I mean by bifurcated sleep? Well, in the 18th century, before, sort of modern lighting and electric lighting and the way society is structured today, people tended to have 2 sleep cycles during the night. They would have one sleep cycle, and then they might have as much as a couple of hours between that sleep cycle and then the second sleep cycle before they got up in the morning. And that meant that time between what they called their first and their second sleep would be a time that it was almost like recaptured time during the day. You might use that time for a personal activity, religious devotion. Some advice manuals during the time recommended married couples should try to conceive children during this time period. But it could be also a time for socializing. You might go out into the night and visit a neighbor or family member. You may actually, if you were involved in a cottage industry like spinning or knitting, you might use that time, that in between sleep cycle time, to get some work done. And if you were going to go out into the night, you got to make sure you bring a lantern with you. Here's just a selection of lantern views, and that's an actual historic lantern in the upper right there. Typically, they're made out of tin or some other light metal with glass windows. And what's interesting about the one on the left there, that guy has what is called it would be like a dark lantern, which was specifically designed to direct the light away from you. And that was actually illegal in a lot of places because they didn't want you hiding your identity in the night. Because if you're walking around with a dark lantern, it means you don't want people to see you, and that's not a good thing. They want to know who you are because they don't want you up to no good. Street lights, most streets didn't have street lights, but major thoroughfares, especially in big cities, did have street lights. Sometimes they were just a rope, from one house to another with a bunch of lanterns hanging off of it. And sometimes they were a bit more formal, as something actually attached to the house. The image in the center is really interesting because Paris had a lot of these lanterns on these hooks that are suspended by a rope during this time period. And actually, the image in the upper right, that's a modern photo from Paris. And during the French Revolution, when you had the rabid mob going after people, they discovered that the lantern, the light posts, were convenient gallows to lynch people they didn't like. And it was such a common event for them to hang people from these light posts that it actually gave rise to a saying in the time period, "To the lanterns," which basically means like string them up. And you can see the cartoon in the middle is making light of that. You have a clergyman and a nobleman is banging their heads on the lanterns of Paris, implying that they might be next be hanging from a lantern. There were also criminals associated with public passage in general, but of course were going to be active both during day and night, but most, nighttime is a convenient cover for criminal activity. These public thoroughfare criminals were so common in the time period that they had special terms. You had people who robbed you on foot, and they were called footpads, and then people who robbed you on horseback were called highwaymen. One of the other things that happened at night was body snatching. That really starts to become a problem in the mid-18th century and probably comes to its zenith in probably about the 1830s or so. And a lot of that has to do with, in Great Britain and British North America, there were few legal avenues in which to acquire bodies for medical schools. And the science is progressing as part of the Enlightenment during this time period, and doctors are recognizing you have to be able to work with a real cadaver to understand how the body works, to understand what you're doing if you're going to do surgery. But they just have these chronic shortages of bodies that they can't, they can't get any. And so they might turn a blind eye when a body shows up at the door and someone wants, a little money for it. Sometimes there were cases where doctors themselves went out body snatching. Often the victims of body snatching would be people on the margins of society that they just assumed no one cared about. But there are a lot of abuses. Doctors who run hospitals would routinely retain bodies of people who died in the hospital for dissection. During the American Revolution, it was very common for American doctors to steal the bodies of dead American soldiers to dissect them. It was so bad, actually, that early in the Revolution, George Washington had to pass a general order forbidding army doctors from stealing the bodies of dead soldiers for dissection. And the image on the right, a woman is stealing teeth from this hanged man. This is actually from Spain. That's actually a work by Goya, by the way. During the late 18th century, doctors realized that if you took a tooth from a healthy person or a recently deceased person and put it into the mouth of someone who had to have a bad tooth extracted, the tooth and the gum would knit. And so there's about a 50-year period of this sort of like tooth mania where people are trying to buy poor people's teeth or steal teeth from, corpses on battlefields. So with all this kind of night chaos going on, you'd like to have some security. And of course, the security primarily during this time period at night would be provided by the Night Watch, which is not these guys. It's these bozos. The Night Watch was a paid position, typically, but it was not exactly glamorous and was often satired. People found the Night Watchman kind of annoying, but they served an important purpose. Typically, watchmen would have a lantern, a rattle, which a wooden rattle, which you can see both the watchmen in these two images have them. It's like a party rattle where you spin it and it clicks. To get attention, they might have a crude weapon like a club. They commonly would carry a watch, so they keep track of time. They would have a beat, which would be a set path that they would follow. And they would check in at different places. They would check to make sure doors were locked. They would call out the time of the day. If they saw any suspicious activity, they were supposed to discourage it. And they'd have to look for signs of fire if a house had caught fire from negligence. In fact, in order to raise community alarm, some night watchmen would have maybe a key to the local church so they could unlock the church door, go in and ring the church bell in the case of an emergency. But at the end of the day, even with the night watchman, security and law enforcement, primarily in most communities, was communal. As a citizen in a community, as a resident, you had a duty by custom and frequently by law to respond if there was a fire or a murder. And if criminal activity was discovered, either in the act or the result of it, usually the result, someone, either a night watchman or someone who happened to pass by, would scream in the middle of the street, "Murder!" And anyone who heard it was expected to respond to it. And you can see here in this image, this is a great image because it shows how these are just common people. They heard someone cry murder. Even you can see the guy behind the fence there holding a lantern, looks like he's yelling. So he might even be calling more people. They've apprehended the criminal who's murdered this poor woman, and you can see a couple of guys are even gathering evidence. One person is got the knife, the murder weapon, and so just everyday people played an important role in law enforcement. Also, it should be remembered that cities in this time period were frequently heavily fortified. In North America, there's a lot of colonial warfare between the French and the British, and various wars that happen with native peoples. So that obviously makes sense to have a fortified community like Albany, the city of Albany here on the left, which has a palisade around it with gatehouses, and those are plans up at the top there showing some of the block houses. But on the right, the city of York here, it still has its stone wall. It's one of the few European cities that, at least in Western Europe, that still has it. Most in the early to mid 19th century tore their walls down as they expanded, but York kept theirs. And then fire, as I mentioned a few times before, again, was a communal effort to fight fires. There were some really devastating fires in colonial America where major colonial cities pretty nearly burned to the ground, including New York, which burned heavily twice. New York City was unusual that it had an actual fire department dating back to the 1730s, which is fascinating to me. But most communities, it was a community effort. There was not a formal volunteer fireman who was responsible. In Albany, for example, the city fire engine was kept in a special engine house behind a church. And so you go ring the bell and then you get the fire engine out. And there were community locations where they would keep leather fire buckets. And people would go, they'd get the buckets. They'd fill them with water, and they'd set up these bucket lines where you pass the full bucket up one side and then the empty bucket down the other. And either you dump the water directly on the fire, or with the fire engine, you would pour the water into the fire engine as it was pumping the water out. This example of a fire engine is actually a late 18th century example that's held at the New York State Museum that's on display. But you can see it's got the pumper, or the levers for pumping, and then at the top it has like this little nozzle or cannon that you would use to then point at whatever you were hosing down. So as I'm rounding out my talk here, I'm kind of at the 1 hour mark, but I'm pretty much at the end. I want to kind of go back full circle here, and I want to talk about the supernatural and what was often termed as superstitious beliefs in the time period. These are various print materials from the very early 18th century. You can actually see the date on some of them, 1709, 1706, 1702. They address issues like ghost sightings, witchcraft. Beliefs in witches are on a steady decline during the 18th century, both in Great Britain and in America. The Salem witchcraft trials happened just before the beginning of the 18th century. It happens at the beginning of the long 18th century in 1692. But those were very much an anomaly. And after that, they recognize very quickly that they went overboard. And generally speaking, witch prosecutions drop off. In Great Britain, they actually take capital punishment for witchcraft off the books in the 1730s. And in America, you see very few witch accusations in the early decades of the 18th century. And most of those accusations seem to end in counter lawsuits where the person who was accused of being a witch sues their accuser, charging them with libel for defaming them. And they frequently won that argument, basically saying there wasn't enough evidence to say they were a witch, so therefore the person had committed libel. And this is, I haven't done a lot of readings, but this is a situation where I'd like to do a quick reading. And that's actually from the book on the far right there, A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft. After the witchcraft trials in the 1690s, a number of people tried to explore what had gone wrong. And one of them is this gentleman, John Hale, who was actually present when it was going on. He actually served as a minister afterward. And he's a firm believer in ghosts, or I'm sorry, in witchcraft. And he basically writes this book. It's a fascinating book. He writes this book basically to prove that witches are still real, even at the same time he acknowledges that the Salem witchcraft hysteria was a hoax. And he has, early in the book, he lays out his evidence by giving documented examples from the past, hundreds of years or so. And here I'm just going to read a brief, excerpt of something he says, and this has a direct bearing on nighttime. He says here, there was, as he's giving an example, there was another executed of Boston, anno 1656, for that crime, i.e. witchcraft, and 2 or 3 of Springfield, one of which confessed, and said the occasion of her familiarity with Satan was this: she had lost a child, and was exceedingly discontented at it, and longed, that she might see her child again. And at last the devil, in the likeness of her child, came to her bedside, and talked with her, and she received it into the bed to her that night and several nights after, and so entered into covenant with Satan and became a witch. Every time I read that, my heart goes out to that woman, that she was probably suffering from depression, from having lost a child, and was having a dream, and then under pressure said, well, it was the devil, but it gives you an idea of sort of how people, obviously this is 50 years before, but he is bringing it back up as evidence. So it's part of the mentality, part of the psyche of the time period, how they're perceiving that nighttime environment and its relation to supernatural evil forces. So I do promise I'm winding down, but there is a couple more things I wanted to touch on related to this topic. One is ghosts. Ghost beliefs, while generally criticized as superstitious by the elite and educated throughout the 18th century, as highlighted by the example I gave earlier from John Locke, was still a common part of belief systems. In fact, not unlike today. And if you tell someone you believe in ghosts, they typically don't think you're crazy. They might not agree with you, but they're not going to think you're weird. And so, there is a specific visual vocabulary for ghosts in this time period that differs from today. Ghosts are very corporeal. They're physical. They're not these see-through misty beings. They're usually exhibited in some sort of burial clothing, or what they were wearing when they died, showing some sort of evidence of their death, like a wound. Often they're bathed in a heavenly light. Historically, burial clothing was a winding sheet, so think like the Shroud of Turin, which would be wrapped around the body and then tied at the top of the head with this little top knot, which you can see in this sculpture from a tomb on the right there. And even though that was largely falling out of fashion as burial clothing in the 18th century, it still remained part of the visual vocabulary. And so it was immediately recognizable as a ghost. One of the things I also wanted to mention is, in this time period, there's a very intense anti-Catholicism. And there's a reason for this. The lower left-hand image is from the Battle of Culloden in 1745, when it was the last attempt by the Catholic members of the British royal family to reclaim the throne. And there was a real threat and belief of a threat that if the Catholic kings came back, they would bring back the Inquisition. And so there was a genuine fear tied to this in this time period. But beliefs in the supernatural events were often associated with Catholic superstition, and were often used in anti-Catholic propaganda during the time period. On the other side of the coin, you also have the birth of new religious movements, baptism or the Baptist faith, Methodism. They're coming about as part of the Great Awakening, which is triggered in the early to mid 18th century, starts in England, comes to America. Parishioners in Great Britain and in America, the established churches or religious systems very much emphasized this idea of you have the learned minister who tells you about godly things, and then if you are saved by God to be resurrected at the end of times, you will demonstrate it through your religious carriage. So basically, you have no role whatsoever in being saved, and this didn't sit well with a lot of people. So when you start getting these traveling preachers who are saying, no, you have a role in being saved, and it's very emotional, it's very exciting. Often it happens outdoors in revivals in the middle of a field. The gentleman on the left here was the most famous figure and popular figure of the Great Awakening. It was George Whitefield, who was an English minister who came to America and did a number of tours during the 18th century. It was extremely popular. He had a traveling pulpit that basically opened up like a suitcase that he could then stand on in the middle of a field, and he could preach to hundreds and hundreds of people. And the importance here was, if you want to be saved, if you feel Christ and the Holy Spirit within yourself, then you will be saved. And these sort of religious gatherings were heavily emotional. People would often demonstrate that they were saved by, rolling on the ground and crying out and claiming that they could see supernatural things. Sometimes people would claim that they could speak in tongues, like in the Bible. And as you can imagine from certain segments of society at the time, this was ridiculous. And they spent a lot of time making fun of this. And so this print on the right, it's called Credulity, Superstition, and Fanaticism, a Medley. And what you can see here, I don't have time to unpack all of this right now, but in the center, you've got George Whitefield, who was famously cross-eyed, so you can tell that's him. In the pulpit above, you have a fire and brimstone minister who's waving a devil and a witch, and you can see his wig is flying back, and he's actually a monk, a Catholic monk. The parishioners are holding little ghost figurines and chewing on them like they're the host. There's a lot going on. What really triggered this was an event called the Cock Lane Ghost. In 1762, in a dingy side street in London, a landlord claimed his daughter was communicating with a ghost by knocking on her bedpost, and that the ghost had told her that she had been murdered. And this actually was brought to the attention to the wider public by a couple of ministers who were followers of Methodism and saw this as some sort of divine intervention. And they wanted to prove it was true because it was a sign of God's intervention in the lives of man. And so they really pushed this. And in comes Samuel Johnson, the man on the left. A lot of people probably know the memes of Samuel Johnson, but he was an important figure in the 18th century. He was the author of the first true English dictionary, famous, educated man. He was like, all right, I'm going to see if this is true. So he gets involved. There's a committee formed. They interview the ghost through a series of knockings. And then they ask the ghost, all right, if you're real, if we go to your tomb at this specific time, you're going to prove you're real by knocking on the lid of your coffin. So the next day, they go to the tomb, they unlock the door, they go in, they stand in front of the coffin, they wait, they look at the watch, and then nothing happens. And it's determined it's a hoax. And so this is the final pin I'm putting into it. I know I went a little over, but I kind of wanted to fit all that in. So we kind of went through this whole sort of trajectory of thought and belief. And what's really interesting is in the middle part of the 18th century, really almost pretty much at the same time that the situation with the Cock Lane ghost is happening, you're getting a shift into an element of entertainment and the aesthetic and the arts and beauty, which I hinted at early on, that really takes the idea of nighttime and things that are scary and strange and supernatural, and instead of fearing them or making fun of them, looks at them as a source of beauty and entertainment. And this is really the birth of the Gothic, which then gives rise ultimately to the Romantic movement. And practitioners like Henry Fuseli, who is an artist, his painting there on the right, William Blake, the poet and printer, and then the author Horace Walpole, who that's an image based off of his book, The Castle of Otranto. Horace is really interesting because he actually brings the Gothic revival style, which is, associated with Catholicism, the Middle Ages, and superstition. And he brings it into the English countryside and really brings it into vogue. And it really influences Great Britain and in America. The Castle of Otranto is considered the first Gothic novel. And it really has all the haunted house tropes you could possibly imagine. He really sets it up. So I'm going to end here by reading a brief excerpt from the Castle of Otranto. And basically what's going on here is there's a prince whose son is supposed to marry this princess, and the son is killed by some supernatural strange force on their wedding day. And so the prince is worried that his family line is going to die out. So he decides he's going to try to convince the princess to marry him instead, her father-in-law. And she's not a great fan of the idea. So this is what's going on. It says here, at Manfred's pursuit of his declaration, Isabella cried, "Look, my lord! See, heaven itself declares against your impious intentions." "Heaven nor hell shall impede my designs," said Manfred, advancing again to seize the princess. At that instant, the portrait of his grandfather, which hung over the bench where they had been sitting, uttered a deep sigh and heaved its breast. Isabella, whose back was turned to the picture, saw not the motion, nor knew whence the sound came, but started and said, "Hark, my lord! What sound was that?" And at the same time made towards the door. Manfred, distracted between the flight of Isabella, who had now reached the stairs, and his inability to keep his eyes from the picture, which began to move, had however advanced some steps after her, still looking backwards on the portrait, when he saw it quit its panel and descend on the floor with a grave and melancholy air. So the portrait of his grandfather has now come to life and is hopped down from the wall. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. And I'm actually going to back over here and show you, this is just a real quick image here that I'll put up here. The precursor of the modern jack-o'-lantern is the turnip lantern. And so I made a little turnip lantern and made it look like the turnip lantern dressed as a ghost here in the 18th century picture. So I just put it up there for your entertainment. But thank you for having me, and I'm happy to address any questions if anyone still has the bandwidth to ask any.
Thank you so much, James. That was awesome. A really great overview of really an entire century of belief and superstition and social culture, which was awesome. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat here. Kathleen said, I think about 15 minutes into your talk, she said, "Why isn't there a tablecloth on the set table under all that silver? My Nana disapproves."
That's so funny. I was wondering about that myself. I had taken the photo at the house, and that's the way they had it. That's a great question. I do not know the answer to that question.
Oh, let's see. Lots of comments about what a wonderful job you did. So let's see any other questions here. Orly said that was wonderful. Thank you. Learned so much. Kids watched too. We will make a turnip lantern.
Nice. I'm going to give you some advice on the turnip lantern.
Just gonna ask if you had advice because I know
Yeah.
it's not
It's
easy.
not easy. I mean, keep in mind that a lot of the examples I've seen are pretty hefty examples. So the best thing is when you go to the grocery store, pick a good sized one. And the reason for that is a turnip doesn't really have a skin per se. And so what happens is when you start to dig into it, it starts to flex and it can break. So what I do is I carve the outside first and then and dig out the eyes and whatnot and do anything I want with it. And then I cut off the bottom and then I take a spoon because the turnip is soft enough for the spoon and you don't risk stabbing a knife through it. So I do these general scooping that way. So that's been pretty successful. That's how I do it. But you always go through the bottom. Don't go through the top. You always go through the bottom.
Interesting. Great advice. Well, I'll have to go to the store and try and find giant turnips this time of year. Orly also says your talk had us seeing the Christmas Carol through this lens.
Yes.
Which I haven't put it up on the website yet, but we are actually going to watch the Muppet Christmas Carol in December at Phillips Manor Hall if anyone wants to join us. The most accurate to the book, Christmas Carol.
Yes, indeed. Yes, it is. That's funny that you bring that up because what's so fascinating to me about A Christmas Carol is that in the sort of modern society, it's been stripped of its cultural context. And when the story came out, it was completely understood to be a ghost story. And in fact, that it was part of a whole class of ghost story Christmas fiction in that time period. So they use a lot of this. Dickens uses a lot of the tropes, and his audience would have been well familiar with all of this. It would not have been strange to them at all.
Well, and you see, what's the Christmas song that goes, scary ghost stories?
Yes,
The
yes.
Glorious Christmas long ago. So
Yes,
even in the 1950s, they're talking about ghost stories.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We have a question from Fergus. Did people sleep longer in the wintertime?
That's a good question. You know, I think one of the big things you have to keep in mind in this time period is, unlike today, today I think generally it doesn't matter what your perceived social class is or where you live. That we tend to push people to stay on consistent schedules. I mean, it's the whole idea of like daylight savings time, which I guess is going away now. But the thing here is that a lot of it depends on what you're doing and what your social class is in the time period, what you have access to. Obviously, if you are a person with less resources, meaning you can't afford tons of candles or light sources, and you have less leisure time, you're not going to be staying out late doing stuff. One of the other things is, especially, you have to also remember America and Britain during this time period was overwhelmingly agricultural. So a lot of their sleep schedule and their lives are going to be tied to the agricultural cycle and the agricultural calendar, which it itself is also tied to how early or late the light comes out. So it's going to vary widely. There are also certain professions that not just night soilmen and night watchmen, but there are other professions where you're going to see a lot more around the clock work. But that doesn't really go into effect significantly until the early 19th century when the Industrial Revolution really starts to tick and they're starting to run factories 24/7.
Yeah, the only pre-industrial job I can think of that might have, outside of regular hours, would be bakers.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They're usually up much, much, much earlier than your typical
those
urban.
darn ovens take a long time to heat up. Yeah, and there's, I guess, in certain regions, I've read, I'm not well versed in this part, but there are certain regions, there's certain professions they tend to have longer hours. I think like tin workers in some respects and things like that. There's also a thing that happens in this time period where there's a concern about growing stratification within professions, where people who own businesses, who've reached the level of master and have the votes in the guilds that control the professions, are preventing other people from rising up. And so what's happening is, it used to be if you were the master, you did all the really important, like, skilled work. So like if you were a tailor, the master would do the buttonholes. And if you were like an apprentice, you were what was called a table monkey. You'd sit on the table and literally just cut patterns out all day, which sounds miserable. And what's happening is you're starting to see, even before the Industrial Revolution, an intense stratification where the journeymen can't go up and the masters stop working, and they're just businessmen. And so they're like working people harder and harder and harder. So I imagine a lot of that fits into more around the clock work in certain respects.
Yeah, so speaking of class stratification, Andrea asks, Ari, the murder print, I see the regular folks who are intervening carrying pitchforks. Is the pitchfork symbolic of every man?
Not quite. That was a print by William Hogarth. And if you're not familiar with Hogarth, he was a incredibly popular satirist and printer, engraver in the early to mid 18th century. And his work is fascinating because a lot of people use them for, like the way I used it, but to show aspects of society. Some people use it to show material culture because it's very detailed about the way a chair looks or something like that. But they're heavily allegorical. And sometimes, if you're not aware of the allegory beforehand, you might be misinterpreting what you're looking at. I do not know specifically in this case. Actually, I was just thinking about it the other day, of whether that particular print is supposed to be in the countryside or in the city. It doesn't look packed enough to be the city, which would indicate farmers. Also might indicate why there's no night watchman there. But Hogarth did some very interesting series of prints. They did plates. There were series, and they'd always tell some sort of story. So you have like that one was, I think, the stages of cruelty, or the progress of cruelty, something like that. I think it's the stages of cruelty. And there's other ones like the Harlot's Progress. The Harlot's Progress is very fascinating because it follows the downfall of a countrywoman who comes to the city and gets taken in by a madam. And one of the ways they show she's a countrywoman is that when she's standing in the middle of the street, she's wearing a straw hat, which at that time was associated with the country. It wasn't yet a fashion item for every lady. So there are certain culturally specific situations like that.
Great. Steph says she found it especially interesting to learn that people used to split the night into 2 sessions of sleep.
There's a book, if you're really interested, there's a book called At Day's Close. And I have my citation down because I'm not always the greatest at remembering authors' names. But it came out maybe about 15, 20 years ago. And he was really the person who innovated looking at this concept of bifurcated sleep and the culture of bifurcated sleep. He writes about it extensively. I have it here somewhere. You can probably share it to folks, Sarah. But let's see. It is At Day's Close, Night in Times Past. And the author's name is the letter A, Roger. And I'm never sure, it's a German looking name. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it. I don't know if it's Eckert or Eckert. Letter E, K, I, R, C, H. And that I highly recommend the book for the whole idea of the bifurcated sleep. And he has like a whole section about like the culture of sleeping in bed with other people, which is really interesting, and he covers a wide range. He covers all of what he defines as the early modern era. So basically from like the Tudor period and before up to like, he really stretches it. He brings it up to like the 1820s, but and he covers like a wide range of communities. So he kind of lumps everything together, but you get the idea.
It's another good transition for a question from Andrea. If drapes on a bed were expensive, how would you describe the cost of a covered bed like in Wuthering Heights?
Well, what's interesting about the about the bed hangings and the bed accoutrements is the big cost. 100% the big cost is fabric, and that is because while labor is cheap, the material is expensive, the raw material. And there's this it's really fascinating the way fabric is used in the time period. Like you could be filthy rich and you order the most expensive outfit possible. And this is a perfect example, George Washington, that did this. He who's one of the richest men in America in his lifetime. He ordered a suit of clothes from a tailor in London, who his neighbor, another extremely wealthy planter, had ordered from. And he said, well, just I'm the same size as him, so just do the same measurements, because he's not going to go all the way to London to get measured. So the guy sends the suit of clothes and it doesn't fit, and it really annoys him. And so he sends it back, and the guy basically pieces in a few little pieces of, like, in the crotch and sends it back to and Washington wore it that way, and a lot of people did. And because the idea is like, you're not going to just toss the whole darn thing away. There's a lot of it, so it's really fascinating. And one other thing I want to mention that's tied to this is fabric was so important in this time period. And keep in mind, this is before the cotton gin, so like cotton was like a high-end fabric in this time period because it was labor intensive to pick the cotton, and also the cotton that was used for the cotton gin was a higher yield cotton but needed the gin to take out the seeds. Lower yield cotton was typically used in the 18th century because it was easier to take the seeds out, but it was lower yield. So again, you still got the problem of not enough product. So anyway, in the it was actually, I think, the 1670s, in England, they passed something called the Woolen Acts. They're trying to protect the woolen industry from competition from continental Europe. And what they do is they forbid the use of other materials than wool in certain applications. And one of the things they forbid is they forbid the use of anything but wool in burial clothing and burial accoutrements, which is, in the 18th century, there's a lot of fabric goes into burial, not just on the person, but on the coffin itself. It's fabric on the inside, on the outside. It's like a little enclosed sofa. And so that obviously doesn't sit well with the wealthy, but there's a loophole. You pay something like a 500-pound fine. A 500-pound fine is something ridiculous like that. And then you can use whatever material you want. So it's one of those things where people are actually paying the fine just so they can put expensive fabric in something that's going to go in the tomb, which is just mind-blowing. But again, kind of puts that in context.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have one last question, which is from Linda, who asks, which historical movies would you say portray interior scenes lit with candles or lanterns the most accurately?
It depends on the scene. They're not all the same. There are certain scenes. Well, first of all, I highly recommend Barry Lyndon from A Material Culture, and even just from the way the 18th century is depicted. I know when it came out in the 1970s, it didn't feel like a Stanley Kubrick movie to people. It wasn't weird. and I think Mad Magazine called it Barry Lyndon because they said it was such a slow burn. But it's the way he really did his research. He used every 18th century trope he could think of, and it covers a long period of time. It's like a 50-year period. It's supposed to be the rise and fall of this one guy, from nothing or next to nothing up, and then through his own stupidity down again. And that one, again, even though it uses a gajillion candles, it has the rooms have the right feel. Like, you could tell he was copying paintings and images. One of the other films that just sticks in my mind all the time is the movie The Duelists, which is a fascinating movie. I believe it was by Ridley Scott in I think it's late 1970s, early 1980s. It's about two French army officers who for whatever reason, can't remember why they're fighting, but they get into a fight in 1800 and it lasts until 1815. And basically, they live through the entire Napoleonic Wars, getting into a new duel every time they see each other, and they can't remember why they started doing it. But because of their honor, they still had to fight the duel. So there's a lot of very interesting scenes in that movie, and that movie's really well done. There's just a lot of just the way it shows domestic life, and there's a few things where they do something weird. I think the example I used, like they're sitting in like some sort of tavern, and it's clearly daytime, and they have a candle on the table, like it's ambiance candle. It's like, come on. But there's another scene where a guy is, I think he's working on shoes or something, and he's like in a room that's kind of dark, and he's got candles, which is like really great, because while ideally you'd be working in a well-lit space, in a city state space is a premium. So sometimes people didn't have greatly lit spaces. So there's some really interesting interior scenes. There's some great scenes that are just entirely lit by just the fire from the fireplace, and there people are sitting in a home just having a conversation. It's just really good. Highly recommend that movie.
Yeah, thank you. It is tough though, because sometimes they make the movies too dark and then you can't see what's going on.
I was trying to watch the end of The Acolyte on Disney Plus today. I had the whole episode was in darkness. I had to turn the brightness way up so I could see what was going on.
Yeah. The film buffs have whole conversations about suspension of belief versus accuracy, and like you can just make it kind of bluish and have ambient light coming from somewhere, and we'll understand that it's nighttime. Anyway, all right. Any last thoughts, James, before we close for the evening?
The only thing I would say is I hope that if you take anything away from this presentation, you obviously I wanted to kind of touch on some of the creepy aspects, but I really wanted to highlight the humanity of the time period. I think of the people in the time period as real people just like you and me, who are for the most part rational human beings, but also deeply flawed. And I wanted to reflect that in the sort of the picture I painted of it. And I hope I was effective.
Yes, you were. We are very much all about humanizing people of the past at Phillips Manor Hall. So I appreciate that was your goal. All right. I think we're going to be done. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. So thank you so much, James, for joining us tonight. Your candelabrum lasted the whole time.
Wow, did a good job.
Yes, Joan, we did record this. It's probably going to take us a while to get up on the internet, but we'll get it up there eventually. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Our next lecture is not until the end of November. I will be talking about the global history of sugar and spice.
Oh, I'm going to tune into that.
And that will be in person and online. So I hope folks can join us either way. All right. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thanks again, James, for the great talk tonight. And we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.